Hey folks, heads up that this episode includes some adult language.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Jill Araya.
And I'm Sarah Beth Gore.
Welcome to the Crafting Audiobooks podcast, where we discuss the art and craft of audiobooks, and we aim to go deep quick.
Welcome, everyone. Very excited to share that today we have Lucas Behrends, casting associate, as our guest. Lucas, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here.
Diving right on in, because we like to go deep quick. When you are planning to cast an audiobook, there are hundreds of narrators, thousands maybe, that you could be choosing from. So how do you decide out of all those narrators these are the ones to invite to this audition?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a really interesting question, and I love it because I get that it can be kind of cloudy on the narrator side of like, how do we choose the people that we're going to cast? But in my eyes, it kind of works like a funnel. So when I receive a project, in that moment, the casting pool can be, any narrator of any background in any location. And then as I start reading the breakdown, these filters kind of start narrowing down my pool of potential actors, right? So gender, voice quality, tone, cultural background or heritage, potentially sexuality, potentially lived experience, potentially accent or language ability. And so these pools become a bit smaller with every descriptor that we're looking for. And, all this to find a narrator who can authentically bring the author's book to life. Sometimes the asks that we get are very broad, and other times, we might only have a handful of viable candidates to authentically represent the text. It really just depends on the project. Sometimes I'll be reading a breakdown and I know exactly who I want to invite. I'm thinking of a specific voice and I'm like, yes, I want this one person. Other times I sit there and I do research for hours or days trying to find the best voice for a project. It's also, this is such an interesting question also because it's very subjective, finding the right voice or finding the correct voice. Who I might think is right for a project might not be who someone else thinks and vice versa. So, it's definitely, it's very up in the air a lot of the times, and we just try and bring the best voices to the table. But, I definitely take advantage of all the tools and resources that we have available to us. I use Ahab and I listen to comparable samples in that genre or tone. I'll look through my emails and I'll see if anyone has mentioned that specific genre or, content. I'll also go through past auditions that we have and see if there's any comparable, voices there. And then we also do reach out to agents as well if we need additional candidates. We also do open call auditions, which I find super fun, because we'll get 100, 300 auditions back. And it's such a great way to, listen to new samples from people I wasn't aware of before. So even if that person might not be right for this project, I might bookmark people from those open calls and, consider them for future projects.
Oh my gosh, there's so much juicy, rich stuff in what you just said. I mean, first of all, I've never heard someone describe that funnel process. That makes so much sense. But I'm also hearing there's this pragmatic funnel process, but there's also this creative magic that you can't quite explain, that's subjective. And sometimes it's immediate instinct, and sometimes you really need to explore, and your subjective creative take might be different from some other producers or the authors. So fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. It really is like a collaborative experience because, I work with my counterpart in the casting department, Ashley. And so we'll both bring names to the table and, listen to both of our suggestions. And then we'll go to the producer, have a discussion with them. They'll give notes or they'll really like our suggestions. And then we might go back and do more research, or we might move on with auditions from there. So there's a lot of eyes and, lots of input in these decisions on who we bring into auditions.
And I also have to follow up on the open call audition process, right? Because what I was hearing you say is it's so fun because it enhances the explorative process, right? And you meet new narrators that way. And I'm imagining maybe you also hear voices, you're like, oh, I wasn't thinking of that take on this project, but actually, right? So like, could you just tell us a little bit more about like details about your process when you're listening to those? Well, you know what? That probably leads to our next question.
I was actually thinking that exact thing. When you get that 300 or 400 auditions on an open call, how do you differentiate between them? I mean, just logistically, you can't listen to 5 minutes from 300 auditions. That would take hours. I don't even want to do the math.
I know.
How do you do that? And what attributes make one audition stand out from another in that kind of situation?
Yeah, so absolutely. The thing is when we're listening to like these open calls, it is really hard to listen to the whole audition. Sometimes auditions can be 3-5 minutes long. So we can tell pretty quickly if someone's audition is in line with what the producer is looking for based on tone, nuance, control of text, confidence, and energy that the candidates bring to the title. Like, we definitely listen to like a good portion of it, especially if it's in line with what we're looking for. But sometimes with these open calls, people will just submit for anything and everything. So sometimes it's very clear, just within the first couple of seconds that they might not be right for this title. But, that doesn't mean that we won't keep them in mind for other titles. But Ashley and I do listen to every single audition that, gets submitted in these open calls.
Wow.
And it's great to have, another person to bounce off of because we have 2 passes, in all of these auditions. So someone that Ashley might have missed, I'll catch, or someone that I might have missed, she'll catch, and then we'll be able to discuss at the end.
Wow.
I'm so interested. I'm kind of going like this a little bit more, I don't know, business logistics than craft maybe, but I'm so curious about, like, it sounds like you have this amazing collaborative process with Ashley, and maybe it is a craft question. I don't know. I find myself wondering like, well, I assume the 2 of you are not handling every single book PRH does. No. And so like, how does it get decided which projects you and Ashley will be casting on and helping with, and which the producers are like, I'm good.
Yeah, so they make those decisions themselves. So Ashley and I, we help support our, team of 19 producers now, 20 now, I think, actually. And so if anyone needs any assistance, or they're, running short on time, or they can't find the right, narrator, or they just have other projects that they're focusing on and, want additional hands in the project, they'll, reach out to Ashley and I and submit the project to us. And sometimes they'll have candidates that they have in mind as well and just want additional options to present to the author. Or sometimes, they'll just let us, pick the candidates that we want to audition. So typically we're working on 5 to 10 titles at a time. And then these titles are submitted to us from, any of the producers.
The collaboration aspect of the way that PRH does casting, I find really fascinating. And I have to think that it has to improve the selection of the final voice that's chosen for the project, because so many people have been able to make sure that it really is the right pick.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think that it's great because a lot of the time the producers get to pick which projects they're working on. So they get to pick things that they're actually interested in and passionate about, which makes, the final product even better.
Ooh, how is it for you on the craft side? Like, so the producer gets to pick the project they're excited about, but you and Ashley work on whatever the producers hand you and ask you to work on. So like, how is that for you creatively to be working on this wide variety of projects? Some might be more to your taste than others.
Yeah, I think, I came into this industry 2 years ago now. So I'm still, some of our producers have been on this team for like a number of years. So they're like a lot more accustomed to what's going to be coming down, the pipeline, and, have they, know what to look out for, know what their tastes are. And I feel like I appreciate the, range of genres that I get to work on because it exposes me to so many other, titles that I wouldn't have picked up if, I was like in a bookstore. But all of them end up being so interesting and, so like just like expansive in a lot of ways. So I definitely appreciate like the range of genres that I get to work on.
I think that that's something that narrators appreciate as well, those of us who are lucky enough to get
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
I want to go back to audition evaluation just a little bit.
Yes.
So we talked some about how you deal with open call auditions and how you've got those multiple passes so that you can catch people that maybe didn't catch your ear the first time around. How is that process different when you are just sending out maybe 3, 5, 10 audition invites and you've got that much smaller pool? What's your process for evaluating the auditions then and deciding which ones get sent to the author?
Yeah, so I'd say on the average project, we're listening to around 10 auditions, maybe 20. I usually aim for 10 to 15 if it's, like on the average project, because I feel like that gives a good number of standouts in the group and also provides a strong range of interpretation to present to the author. And it's hard to, pick out one thing that makes an audition stand out over others. It can really be like a range of things. Like maybe the candidate really grasps like the tone of the piece, or their specific dialogue for a character is really strong and sounds really natural, or they really nail the tension between two characters and are able to, hold that listener in the anxiety of a thrilling piece. I think what really makes a good sample is understanding what the text is asking you for, and being able to, in that moment, take this listener on this journey of discovery with you. And that can be really hard because you, as the narrator, have read the text, you know what's coming, but the listener doesn't. And you have to be able to like immerse the listener in, what's going on in that present moment. So it's really just at the end of the day, like vibes really, and like is this something that I want to continue listening to?
Sure, staying in the text and, like you said, carrying the listener with you.
Exactly.
Mm.
It's also so dependent on project, on the title, because something that could really work for one tone or one genre might not be exactly what we're looking for something else. Like a lot of the times, or sometimes we'll have like a fiction piece or a contemporary like fiction, and people will submit a sample, but it comes across very like a nonfiction read, very more monotone and less like having that strong, like empathetic connection to the text. So it really just depends. And some people have a stronger, stronger range in different genres.
It reminds me of like, I often think of like George Clooney versus Meryl Streep. Like George Clooney is George Clooney in every movie, but it works if you cast him in the role, right? Meryl Streep is a shapeshifter. And I've noticed that with audio narrators as well, right? Some are like, you nail this thing, like you rock it and cast you in that till the cows come home. But then other narrators are shapeshifters and they can feel those different genres and tones and have and like play with them with a wider range.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Lucas, what is one moment of audiobook craft that you've experienced sometime during your career that especially excited you? It could be something you worked on or something you listened to. And please share why that moment felt so exciting.
Okay, cool. So I've been so excited for this question. And to answer it in a way that makes sense, I'm going to provide like a little background on my journey to this position. So I went to school for English Lit, and one of the areas I really gravitated towards was modern and contemporary American queer lit, so queer lit over the past 100 years or so. And in these classes, we discussed like the beginning of queer authors being published by bigger publishing houses and reaching like the mass media in what would be considered closer in content to what's being published now, like explicit queer characters who name themselves as gay, as lesbian, as queer. And, of course, there have been queer lit and queer characters all throughout history in every genre. And I could talk about this for so long, but I'm just going to focus on one example right now for the purpose of diving deep quick. So the title I want to focus on is a book published in 1952 called Spring Fire by author Vin Packer, which was actually a pseudonym for the author Mary Jane Meeker. This book is credited as one of the first lesbian pulp fiction novels, pulp meaning like popular and sensational, but also of like a poor quality, like similar to like celebrity magazines that we have now. And these like novels were really popular around World War II when the military would distribute small paperbacks to soldiers as cheap entertainment. And then after the war, people were still like accustomed to having this cheap media, so they continued being published. They would often have themes of erotic situations, drug use, crime, murder, and homosexuality, things that would be sensational escapism for, the world around them. Because they were understood to be like, quote unquote, like not intellectual or upstanding media, they weren't as restricted as other forms of publishing. So Spring Fire was one of these titles. The only difference is that this title was written by a lesbian for, more of like a female audience, whereas a lot of these books were written by men for a male audience. So in this book, the protagonist is a freshman in college and she joins a sorority. She begins like a romantic relationship with her roommate, and then throughout the book, she unpacks heteronormative relationships and what she's been brought up to believe. She even like looks up the definition of lesbian in the dictionary. And this was like they had this beautiful little relationship, and then towards the end, you really think that these characters are going to have a happy ending. Right. But here's like the catch, right? So because the author was working with a publishing house that wanted to print her book in mass market, it meant that her book was going to be sent through the postal service, which meant that it was going to be subject to inspection and censorship by the postal service. So they couldn't directly print something that was, quote unquote, in support of the queer community. So to get around this, the editor asked the author to rewrite the ending so that the two women didn't end up together. This way, the publisher wouldn't be held liable for encouraging or supporting, these deviant homosexual themes, right? Crazy, but I mean, it's 1950, so
it was the reality at the time.
Exactly.
I also think that shit like this happens in modern day in more nuanced, subtle ways. And
Absolutely.
Hopefully is happening less and less.
Yeah, there's definitely like room today, obviously, for publishing companies to continue to, diversify their inclusion. Absolutely. But so in an effort to get her book published, she obliged. And the last section of the book sees the roommate claim to have never loved the protagonist. She gets back with her boyfriend, and the protagonist ends up having a mental breakdown and ending up in a mental hospital. So
wow.
This was, this was very common in the pulp fiction genre. No like gay characters were allowed to both be gay and have a happy ending to be published in mass market. They either had to say that they're straight or, suffer some terrible, sad ending. I bring this up so that we have context for how hard queer authors have worked to be published in a mass market setting. And the thing is this title, even with the sad ending, it's still regarded as a very important book in the lesbian genre, and it inspired a lot of other writers. At the time, titles like this were like a pillar of hope to people who didn't see themselves represented in other forms of media. And also, it was much more accessible in areas where there wasn't a lot of queer representation in everyday life. So more remote areas where, if people weren't in cities. So, the people were able to see this character unpacking heteronormative relationships and having a loving relationship with someone of the same gender. And, we have to keep in mind that this was a white author who had the privilege to be in talks with major publishers. As you can imagine, it was, even harder for authors of color to get their work published. Even with the rise of queer-run publishing houses in the 60s and 70s, authors of color continued to be ostracized from the predominantly white industry. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. And all of this to say that representation is so important. And there has been such a long and brutal fight from marginalized communities to have authentic representation published in mass market. And this wasn't that long ago. This book was published in the same decade that, my dad was born in. So that's only one generation ago, 70 years. And, if we take a look around us, now, if you walk into a bookstore, there's there's hundreds of books now that are great examples of queer representation. And, even one generation ago, people this would have been so sensational to have access to the amount of representation that we have now. And obviously, there are still a lot of ways the industry can continue to improve. But, I think the victories that we do have are super important. And I bring this up, my long little history rant, to bring up the title I want to talk about. I recently had the honor of working on a title called Breathe by Maya Kobabe and Dr. Sarah Pietzmeyer. The title is a graphic guide to chest binding with real life stories and research-backed evidence. It combines a study done with gender expansive individuals who use chest binding in their daily lives and evidence-based resources on binding to create an extremely accessible and inclusive guide. It's such a great resource for anyone who binds, any family members of people who bind, and anyone who just wants to know more about why people use this gender affirming tool. It highlights the good, the bad, and the painful, and it's gives a lot of safe binding techniques as well. And this was a really full circle moment for me, because not only did this research study exist, not only did it get turned into a great accessible guide for a mass market audience by one of the biggest publishing houses, not only was it slated for audio to make it even more accessible, and then not only am I, as a trans person who used binding as a gender affirming tool, getting to work on this title, but I also got to connect trans and gender expansive individuals to the project to represent the characters in the book.
That is so beautiful. Oh my goodness.
So I just, all of this to say that representation is so important. And, I would have loved to have a guide like this when I was a teenager. I was getting my information from Tumblr,
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
It's powerful and exciting. And thank you so much for the history lesson. I did not know that, and I am very moved.
I kind of want there to be an audiobook of that first book that you mentioned that has the original ending.
Yeah. Is there one?
The author definitely, she's gone on record and was I'm basically saying that she was embarrassed that she had to rewrite the ending. Because she was approached to have it republished in a hardback or a different edition that wasn't just the pulp fiction edition, and she didn't want to do it because she was so upset about the ending. But I'm glad that she did, because it's still a great book, and a lot of people found it inspiring at the time.
Oh, why didn't somebody approach her and ask her to rewrite the ending the way she envisions it? That would be a great project.
I know. You can kind of stop reading at a certain point, and there is a good ending, you can just ignore the last 20 pages or whatever.
I bet she did that purpose. It's funny because when you told the story, I found myself wondering, what was the impact on her as an author to make that trade-off choice? Because there's a lot, and I'm sure there's, hopefully less and less of it today, but I bet there are still trade-off choices of what do I need to do to this book because the representation is so important and it's not going to be published unless I, and like
Exactly.
there's no easy answer to that question. Ooh.
An indie author that I am working with right now actually had that kind of situation, and her
Oh,
decision
really?
is that hers was based on having non-white characters in her novels, and she made the decision that she was going to stay indie and no longer pursue traditional publishing at all.
Wow,
Because
that's a brave choice.
the agent that she was talking to was insisting that she change the racial identity of some of the characters, and she was not willing to do that.
That's crazy. Oh my God. I
Yeah.
can't believe that happened. I mean, I guess I can, but that's so unfortunate.
Yeah, it was actually just a couple weeks ago.
Oh my
So,
gosh.
yeah, it still
Well,
happens. As many strides as we are making,
yeah,
a lot of work still needs to be done.
absolutely. Completely agree.
Thank you for sharing that story, Lucas. That is,
Yeah, of course. I really enjoyed working on the project, and it was a really cool project. And it's also interesting because in the graphic guide there are a lot of tips and techniques, and in the audio version you actually get a downloadable PDF of those visual components as well, which is very special for audio because usually there's no downloadable aspect of the project.
sure.
I want to take a moment before we move to our last question to unpack why representation. I mean, I'm sure this would be its own like college class, but briefly unpack why representation is so important, because we all agree clearly. And I'm just struck by the power. I think that maybe it can be hard to understand unless one thinks about it really hard, does their own inner work, or is a part of a marginalized community, how fucking powerful it is. Because when there's no representation, it's like society says you don't exist. This isn't real. You don't exist. You're alone. And bringing representation into not only existence, but like accessible existence, but even more than that, like mainstream publishing is this powerful human way to say, like, you exist and this is real. And
Yeah.
I just wanted to like pause and speak to that for a moment. And if either of you have anything to add, I'd love to hear.
No, that was beautifully put. I completely agree. And that's so important to note as well.
And I love, especially for the guide on chest binding that you were referencing, it's not just that you exist and you are valid and you matter, but here are the tools that you need to express yourself in the way that feels right. And that
affirms
who beautiful.
You are.
Yeah, that is beautiful.
Oh my goodness.
Good stuff.
Talk about going deep quick. We're running deep today.
Wow. Well, I would love to move on to our last question. And this is a question that all of us will get to answer. And the question is this: what is exciting to you about the craft right now today? So, Lucas, you just talked about something really big that, over your whole career, going back to your college studies, is exciting. But, is there some little nugget that's exciting you right now today? And Sarah, I'd actually love for you to go first.
Absolutely. Okay, so I wrote this up before our talk, and it's still like exciting to me. And I feel like there's new context to it based on our conversation today.
Sure.
So the thing that's exciting to me is that this phrase came to me, that phrase, leap and the net will appear. What came to me is commit and the net will appear. So what happened is I was working on an audition. It was just like so beautifully written and had this like subtle and unstable tone in the narrative. And then at one point in the dialogue, this 13-year-old is so triggered and so scared, she literally starts screaming for her mother, who actually is an abusive mother and she wouldn't normally run to for like intense, beautiful, amazing writing. And I was like, I can't do this justice. Like, I am not enough. There is no way. I cannot bring this to life in any way that I would deem like even approaching acceptably done. But that phrase came to me, commit and the net will appear. And so I leapt and realized how deeply, like, there's a moment, there's a time where the only difference between like very, very solid acting and great acting is self-trust. And I'm not claiming like, oh, I did great acting, but I am pleased with my progress as an actor, that I took the leap and I'm pleased with the results. And that I'm just chewing on that self-trust. And then today, in the context of this, I'm moved to thinking about the leap that the first people who step forward and say, I am going to create this representation because it doesn't exist. Talk about commit, leap, and the net will appear. Like the courage. So it brought a new depth to my little phrase that came to me that excited me so much.
Wow, that's
Thank you for
beautiful.
sharing.
Yeah. That
Thank
sounds like
you.
such a beautiful title as well.
Oh, it is. And Jennifer and I both got to audition for it. So I'm hoping one of us gets to
Yeah, we did. We
narrate
did.
it.
And yeah, I know exactly when Sarah was talking about, how deep and intense and the unstable narrative, because the protagonist isn't really sure what's happening. And it's so beautifully written. So hopefully one of us will get it. We'll see.
Jennifer, what's exciting you today?
Sure. So I am working on a very long-term project because it's a series and each book in the series is over 20 hours. So this is like taking a long time to work through the prep and the books themselves and whatnot. But the series is an alternate history series, which is not something that I normally narrate. This is definitely a stretch for me in terms of style and genre. But specifically just getting to do something in the alternate history genre, it's looking at what the world would be like if several specific things in history had happened very differently. And it is amazing to me just how completely books can transport us to a totally different world. Fantasy and sci-fi do that, and even a general fiction book can take us outside of our own reality. But the way that this alternate history is allowing me to experience a world that is not our world, it kind of gives us a window into like, what if situations, or makes me think of a choose your own adventure book. And if this decision had been made, what would have been the butterfly effect consequences? And so I am just enjoying inhabiting another world. Now, granted, the world in this particular alternate history series is not a positive one. It takes place during World War II, and really bad things are happening, even worse than what actually happened. So it gets bad, but I am enjoying the journey. So yeah, just the transformative and transportative power of books is what I'm really sinking into right now.
That's amazing. I love alternate history titles. I think they're so fun to think about because it's like, like what if truly things happen differently?
Exactly. Yeah, it's been fun, and I still have a lot of work to do on this series.
That sounds like a big undertaking.
It is. Well, Lucas, I would love for you to share what right now, this very instant, has you really lit up with joy and excitement about audiobooks?
Yeah, so I wanted to answer this question around the idea that I think we're at a very pivotal moment in the audiobook industry with, the rise of AI, and especially as people are standing up and really taking the space and holding ground in saying that we as a society value spoken word storytelling. And just because, we can make a computer read the words on a page, it doesn't mean that it has the same effect as someone who shares the lived experience with the text and speaking it aloud has, with our conversation of representation. I think there's a lot of good things that AI can do to help automate certain aspects of our society, but I can see that this common understanding is growing that making the audiobook narrator obsolete would not be one of those good things. So I'm just excited that these conversations of authenticity and representation are really happening in a lot of facets of the industry.
I completely agree. It is. Well, Lucas, thank you. This has been a truly delightful and frankly quite moving discussion. Thank you for sharing your experience, and thank you for being here with us today to talk about the craft of audiobooks.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been so great.
Thanks so much for listening to Crafting Audiobooks. We've been your hosts, Jennifer Jill Araya
and Sarah Beth Goer.
Wishing you happy audiobook listening and/or crafting.
Bye for now.